Basically, in my talk today, I will be presenting a recently published monograph of mine titled What Happened to the Soviet University, with a focus on one part from this monograph, focusing on the internationalization of universities. This book brings together my work of more than a decade on higher education transformations in post-Soviet countries. It is obviously an academic book. At the same time, it's a very personal work of mine. I was born and raised in one of these countries. As Anatoly already mentioned, it's Georgia. I went to university at one of the former Soviet universities described in this book, Tbilisi State University. This is the institution where I spent some of my formative years and where I received what I now describe as excellent education and where I made some lifelong friends. My scholarly engagement with the study of higher education in the Caucasus, Central Asia, Russia, and Eastern Europe started at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I did my master's degree, then continued at Cambridge, where I did my doctoral degree, and at Oxford now for 10 years, where I have been based as an academic. So I was an international student myself at Harvard and Cambridge universities. Thus, the internationalization of higher education is a deeply personal experience for me, besides being a central topic of my academic work. This book itself was written entirely during the pandemic. I started writing it in April 2020 and submitted it to the publisher in December 2021. This is quite important because, as you will hear and as you will see in the book, if you have a chance to read it, it does not describe the latest events in Ukraine and in Russia. This book is about universities, okay? This book is about change. So there is a lot of discussion of what change means, what transformation means, and so on and so forth in the book. It's about change of one particular type of university, the Soviet university, and I will explain what I mean by Soviet university very shortly. Change of this university in the decades that followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This book adopts historical perspective to adopt these changes through time. So this is the contents page of the book. It goes through various different sections. It starts with the overall in-depth description of what the Soviet university was. Then it's followed by 3 substantive chapters. And today I'm presenting the chapter, largely one chapter, internationalization of universities, okay? Now, the departure from the Soviet university tradition that this book investigates was triggered, obviously, by the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This was a seismic event that gave rise to vibrant new scholarship in social sciences and vibrant new international development discourses. Transitology became the dominant approach in international development and social scientific scholarship. Transitology, as many of you know, judging from who I see on screen here, participants or attendees of the talk, you know probably what transitology is, largely preoccupied with economics, transition from planned to market economy, and politics, transition from totalitarian to democratic governance. Normative assumptions of transitology have been underpinned by modernization theory, assuming that Western economic and political traditions of free markets and of a democratic political culture would be the most appropriate for all countries in the region. Transitology has been universalist, focusing on convergence, simplification, and sameness, and it has been very prominent in academic, government, media, and popular discourses. Now, what I argue in this book is that linear thinking underpinning transitology cannot do justice to the turbulent processes of post-Soviet transformations. And I suggest that dialectical thinking may be more suited to recognize chaotic, contradictory forces within societies and within higher education institutions. These forces have been sometimes balanced out and at other times in conflict, when old ways of doing things have been challenged in a struggle, a new state of balance emerged and the tensions have been temporarily resolved. Whenever old ways of doing things are challenged, the existing system tries to resist the change at any cost. So change and continuity, chaos and order, system breakdown, stagnation and transformation are all dynamics of the dialectical process. So the overall kind of mindset that I adopt in this book is of a dialectical thinking rather than transitology thinking. And I argue that transformations of these universities have been dialectical, with continuous tensions between the old Soviet and new ways of teaching, organizing, learning, establishing partnerships, and so on and so forth. I think I skipped one slide. Oh, I skipped 2 slides. So what is a Soviet university? What do I call the Soviet university? At the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there were 946 higher education institutions, okay? The Soviet higher education system consisted of comprehensive institutions called universities and specialized higher education institutions called institutes, okay? So 904 of these institutions were called institutes out of 946, and 69 were comprehensive higher education institutions known as universities, okay? So this book entirely deals with universities, okay? Those 69 universities that existed at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You see a map here, which is an appendix of the book, and the map shows how those universities, 69 Soviet universities, were spread across this vast empire. So out of 69, 40 were in Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, 10 in Ukraine, 3 in Belarus, 3 in Uzbekistan, 2 each in Georgia and Kazakhstan, and the rest of the republics had 1 university each, okay? Now, very important thing is that although there were the 69 at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they were different kinds of Soviet universities. Okay, they were rather heterogeneous institutions. Now, why? Because they were established at very different periods in different countries. Okay, so Vilnius University is the oldest in the former Soviet countries, dating back to 1579. Okay, in Lithuania, as well as in Ukraine, in Russia, in Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and the last few, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, in the very last few years before they were occupied by the Soviet Union, all of these countries had universities prior to becoming part of the Soviet Union, okay? And they were largely established following the European university tradition. Countries in Central Asia, in contrast, had their first universities established in the Soviet Union, okay? Therefore, the traditions, the histories of these universities are quite different. Those that existed prior to the Soviet Union were established outside the Soviet Union, and those that were established within the Soviet Union. Now, I do not want to go into great detail on what was the Soviet University. There is a designated chapter in this book, and I think most of the characteristics that are described in the chapter would be quite familiar to many of you. I will just focus on one aspect that links directly to the topic of this talk, which is international cultural diplomacy. Okay? As anti-colonial movements spread across Africa, Asia, Latin America, in the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to extend its activity to developing countries. In 1961, Patrice Lumumba University was established in Moscow. It was named after murdered Congolese politician and independence leader. And this was a milestone in the internationalization and cultural diplomacy, okay? So international students, large-scale activities started in the Soviet Union in the early 60s to attract international students from these, what was called developing countries. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So these students were considered to be advocates of communist ideology after they would finish their studies in the Soviet Union, and it was hoped that they would be promoters of the Soviet model of higher education in their home countries when they would go back. The Soviet Union viewed international student recruitment as a critical instrument for international cultural diplomacy goal of developing pro-Soviet elites, okay? This process started in the 60s and culminated in the 80s when 126,000 foreign students studied in the Soviet Union in the late 80s. This was 11% of international mobile students globally at that time. So the Soviet Union was the third most attractive destination for foreign students after the USA and France, okay? However, it was quite a stringent process based on affirmative action policies by country and by social class. So it was mostly working class students and students with agriculture background who would be attracted to who would be admitted to Soviet higher education institutions, and students from specific countries. For example, the most popular countries of origin for these students, 126,000 who studied there in the late 80s, were Mongolia, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Cuba, Bulgaria, Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Poland. Okay, it was quite clear that there was the view of the world was rather black and white. So there were countries that the Soviet Union considered allies and countries that the Soviet Union considered enemies. So it was mostly with allies or future allies that the Soviet Union wanted to have exchanges and to fund those students to study in the center of the empire. Most of the students were located in the universities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So this black and white logic of viewing the world continued in the post-Soviet institutions. This binary mindset remained a major characteristic of the societies. And one of the demonstrations of this in quite a number of societies is that policies nowadays, which are leaning towards the left, towards more socialist views and assumptions, are seen as less acceptable by large groups of population in many of these countries, and policies leaning towards the right, towards marketization, towards meritocracy and competition seem to be much more welcome. So this was very briefly about international cultural diplomacy. So two major changes happened with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Obviously, the planned economy collapsed, and this led to the marketization of economies. This was a brand new reality, and very little knowledge existed how to deal with this brand new reality without planned economy. And the second big change in these societies across almost the entire region was that borders opened up relatively, and international connections became possible. Because during the Soviet period, for those who may not know this, borders were entirely closed. So there were very little international collaborations in research, for example. There were international exchanges of students, but in terms of research, in terms of collaboration and partnership of universities, there was very little going on. Okay, so with the dissolution of Soviet Union, societies opened up relatively. Very different contexts in different countries, of course. Turkmenistan might have opened up much less than Latvia, for instance, but still the changes were there, and in almost all countries possibilities increased for international cooperation and partnerships. So these two broad changes of collapse of the planned economy and opening up of borders led to the marketization and internationalization of universities. So both of these, I argue in the book that these were very different type of change processes, that marketization was much more abrupt process of change, while internationalization was slightly more incremental, okay? And both processes resulted in certain continuities and discontinuities. Marketization as an abrupt change led to the breakdown of some university structures and partial replacement with new structures. Soviet universities proved to be rather resilient throughout these processes, and many to date remain flagship institutions in their respective national contexts. Internationalization as a more incremental change, I argue, led to more gradual transformations of universities and adaptation of new expectations brought about by globalization processes. Again, the majority of universities, Soviet universities, appear to have benefited from this process when compared to other higher education institutions in the same countries and same contexts, okay? So many of these countries, many of the former Soviet countries, are located along the ancient Silk Road routes. Okay, these were transcontinental routes connecting China, India, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Black Sea area. Therefore, the region, I argue, has a rich history of trade, entrepreneurship, multi-ethnicity, multiculturalism, and multilingualism. These traditions were suppressed during the Soviet times. All mercantile activities were considered to be bourgeois capitalist. Any cultural artifact linked with languages and ethnicities from outside the USSR were seen as threats to the well-being, to the security of the people in the Soviet Union. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, marketization and internationalization gained ground rapidly across the region in most sectors of public life, including education. While these two processes have generated some critical responses from social scientists, both of these processes, marketization and internationalization, have been broadly seen as legitimate processes supported by the majority of stakeholders in these countries. I will skip through these definitions, just say that I start this book with a very simple definition of internationalization as cross-border flows and mobility that increase international connectedness, okay? Cross-border flows and mobility for increasing international connectedness. And there are different types of cross-border mobility, as we know from the literature. It can be mobility of knowledge, students, academics, programs, languages, norms, practices, and so on and so forth. So what follows, I will largely focus on a little bit on educational mobility and then slightly more on cross-border mobility in relation to the ideas, practices, programs, and institutions in relation to research as well. Internationalization in this region is very often used as a synonymous term to Westernization, Europeanization, Americanization. Normally is a very important word here, I think. Normally, the West has been seen in former Soviet countries as a symbol of prosperity, progress, and the high quality of life, a general assumption being that the internationalization of universities will ensure the provision of education in line with international Western, European, or American standards, which will lead to economic growth and poverty reduction. Okay, very kind of transitology type of thinking. When I said normally, this is a general consensus, I think, in most of the societies, except for Orthodox religious groups, which exist in all of these societies, cultural conservatives, and authoritarian governments, which are very powerful in quite a few of these countries. Okay, so except for Orthodox religious groups, cultural conservatives, and authoritarian governments, generally the West is viewed very positively, and the internationalization or Westernization, Europeanization of higher education of universities is seen as a very positive trend. Okay, academics, policymakers, and students have been keen to learn about various international practices and the ways that they can implement them at home. Okay, at the same time, a body of critical scholarship exists on Westernization, Americanization, modernization, and Europeanization of former Soviet academia. You can, some of the examples are writings by Amsler, Bruno, Mignolo. The scholarship explores how former Soviet countries, and this is a quote from Mignolo, fell prey to Eurocentrism's magic and its belief in the myth of scientific knowledge over subjectivity. This critical discourse fits with the discourse on the Western Enlightenment principles of modernity and progress being underpinned by a logic of coloniality, domination, and development. Western influences form one part of the multi-layered coloniality framework that I proposed a few years ago, which is on the slide. This framework is used to conceptualize the Western on the one hand, and then Russo-Soviet influences in higher education and research in this country. In this paper on the topic, I explained that comparative and international education scholarship related to this region is dominated by Western academic thought on the one hand and a Russia-centered empirical approach on the other hand. There is quite a bit in the book on the Russian encounter with the Caucasus and Central Asia, as well as with Ukraine and Belarus as a post-colonial encounter, in the same manner as the Western encounter with Orientalism, Islamism, Africanism, and primitivism. The Russian encounter with individuals from the Caucasus, from Central Asia, Belarus, Ukraine has shown evidence of ethno-nationalism and xenophobia. I use some linguistic analysis to show this. Individuals from the Caucasus and Central Asia are viewed in Russia as inferior, others requiring modernization and acculturation. Russia is entitled to rule and civilize these others. As argued by Vladimir Putin, Russia should continue its civilizing mission on the Eurasian continent. This mission consists in ensuring that democratic values combined with national interests enrich and strengthen our historic community. End of quote by Vladimir Putin. Why do I quote this? I quote this in order to really focus your attention on the fact that there have been these two major internationalization trends in these countries. One, largely Westernization, Europeanization, and so forth, links with the West, and another keeping very strong links with Russia, which is also internationalization, because Russia is a different country, although not really recognized by Vladimir Putin, that it's a different country, because he still talks about the entire region being a historic community. So let me start with a few words on Russia and the links with Russia. So if you look at the former Soviet, there was a lot of research behind the book, obviously. So we have done analysis together with a research assistant that I had of all websites of this university. So we saw how many students they enroll, what kind of partnerships they have, and so on and so forth. Then we had a survey of academics. So from the data that we have at hand, it was clear that two former Soviet universities with the largest international student population are still located in Russia. These are Kazan Federal University with more than 9,000 international students, and the famous People's Friendship University of Russia, the same University Patrice Lumumba University that is now called People's Friendship, with 7,000 universities, 7,000 international students. So Russian universities, many of these from these thousands are students from former Soviet countries. According to the 2019 UNESCO data, because there is no other data I checked yesterday that is more recent, so still 2019, Russian universities remain the most popular destinations for students from former Soviet countries, especially from Central Asia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Azerbaijan. And many of the most prestigious universities that students would target, would aspire to enroll in our former Soviet universities. The education of international students in Russia is seen as a process of formation of pro-Russian national elites. This is a quote from Russian policy documents, and it's believed that these national elites will help, again, quote, to promote Russian interests, including long-term ones, in their home countries. Now, two former Soviet universities, Lomonosov Moscow State University and Chelyabinsk State University in Kazakhstan. Why did I say that? And Chelyabinsk State University operates several branch campuses across these countries. Lomonosov Moscow State University has 6 branch campuses in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. And Chelyabinsk State University has a branch campus in Kazakhstan, So what does this mean? So Russian universities, former Soviet universities, try not only to attract students from other former Soviet countries largely, but also try to open up branch campuses in those countries in order to educate students who are not who prefer to stay at home and want to pursue Russian education, especially Lomonosov Moscow State University education, which is considered to be one of the best universities in the region according to international rankings and based on its historical reputation. Now, what differentiates these branch campuses from other types of branch campuses that we know, because lots of other countries have branch campuses of their universities in abroad? It's very different in nature from others. So unlike transnational higher education practices elsewhere, transnational education decisions in Russia are made not at the institutional level, but at the federal level, resulting in the Russian state, rather than private universities, establishing branch campuses in the near abroad, as they would refer to these countries. Furthermore, in contrast to other international contexts where branch campuses are viewed as high-risk ventures driven by profits and are set up in accordance with business model and principles, Russian university branch campuses do not operate as profit-making institutions. And I have done extensive work on this in one of my papers, and this is described in the book as well, if you want to hear slightly more on this. So Russian branch campuses have found a niche in providing education, international education, to specific groups of marginal students who are not academically or otherwise prepared to study abroad in Russia or other countries, or to enter flagship institutions at home, but to those who have the potential to represent the thinking class in the target countries, as described by Fomineh. Russian international branch campuses appear to serve as a mechanism of informally diffusing narratives on Russian ideas and values, according to Antoinetta, and for what Starchok refers to as keeping in direct contact with the future generations of leaders to shape their thinking. Thus, these branch campuses in the near abroad are oriented to perhaps exert political and cultural influence on these previously colonized people in the former Soviet countries. Now, another side of the internationalization is links with Europe and the Bologna process. I am pretty certain that most of you have heard about the Bologna process, which is the largest higher education reform in the world, probably higher education initiative in the world, that brings together a whole region of Europe and stretches much beyond Europe in terms of establishing the European higher education area. Out of 15 countries, all but 4 in Central Asia are part of the Bologna process, and they have introduced recycled degree system, credit transfer system, quality assurance standards, academic mobility, and so on and so forth. Many of you know quite a bit about this, but what may be slightly less known is that views of Bologna process is not homogeneous across this region, okay? While in some countries, the views are absolutely positive, like in Georgia, this Bologna process is an embodiment of the positive transformation of higher education, okay? And there are quotes in the book where policymakers and administrators describe Bologna process as a step to the Georgian membership of the European Union. So it's kind of mythical view, positive view of how good it is. On the other hand, the views are quite different. For example, in Belarus, which is also a member of the Bologna process, views may be slightly more skeptical because of the authoritarian regime. Any links with foreign countries are quite tediously investigated within universities. Very often academics have to prove why they are entering specific collaborations or why they're setting up student exchanges and so on and so forth. So it is much trickier. I have also had some evidence from the Baltic states where academics raised questions about the potential of new source of cultural imperialism coming from the Bologna process. Okay, so quite different views. There are also different views on the quality assurance mechanisms that Bologna process has supported. There are very stringent internal and external quality assurance mechanisms for universities implemented in a number of these countries following the Bologna model and following the need to implement European standards and guidelines for quality assurance in higher education. In this book, I show a number of different critical perspectives on the standardization of higher education that the Bologna process has brought about. And I ask questions on whether standardization can go hand in hand with intellectual curiosity-driven creativity and the advancement of diverse ways of knowing within universities. So there are several points raised here which highlight the problematic nature of the Bologna process in terms of promoting instrumental rather than more humanistic values in HE, in terms of bureaucratizing teaching and maintaining, to a certain extent, some aspects perhaps of the inner logic of Soviet managerialism at universities. I will have to skip through the partnerships part, but we can talk about in the Q&A perhaps. Partnerships part is all about how universities establish partnerships, about memoranda of understanding, about centralized approach to all sorts of international relations in former Soviet universities through international offices. So we can talk about this in greater detail later. I really want to focus on this part now, which is on the universities' internationalization of research activities. So a key characteristic of the Soviet research, as I mentioned already, was its isolation from international influences. Okay, Soviet citizens were seldom allowed to travel abroad, hence the opportunities for international collaboration were extremely limited. Although the dissolution of the Soviet Union led to opening of borders, developing international contacts from scratch was not straightforward, especially in the first 2 decades, okay? And the key problems have been limited experience of academics of forming such collaborations, language barrier, scarce resources available for establishing cross-border collaborations, and limited information available on the latest developments in their respective disciplines. Now, universities and governments in these countries have received support from multiple international and supranational organizations to develop the research function of universities. We have recently published an edited volume, and I see some of the contributors in the audience, on the development of research capacity in at universities in the former Soviet countries, where we describe in great detail every country case, okay? Just to mention here that the Soviet universities were relatively stronger in terms of research capacity than other institutes, very broadly in a very generalized fashion, because there were institutes as well that had good research capacity, but very broadly universities were stronger. That's why to date, they remain flagship institutions. And as I will mention as I go through this slide, the Soviet universities are the ones from this region that feature in international rankings, which are largely driven by research indicators, okay? So support was received, and this support has been particularly helpful for Soviet universities that already had some research traditions from the Soviet period. Now, some of the very interesting examples of support, I would say, was the support received by European part of the former Soviet countries, specifically Baltic states from other European countries. So the Danish research councils, for example, in the early 1990s, evaluated the research system in Latvia, The Swedish research councils worked with Estonia, and the Norwegian Research Council evaluated the Lithuanian system. And these experts from Nordic countries prepared comprehensive reports, including recommendations on the development of research in these three countries. And these recommendations included some of the key ideas that were later implemented widely in these countries and quite successfully. As some of you may know, these countries were one of the first that merged research institutes with universities, reorganized doctoral training, established competitive research council systems, supported academics to improve English language skills, supported academic mobility, and so on and so forth. So that kind of international support has been quite crucial. Other countries also received various kinds of international support, largely from the European institutions, I would say, to develop partnerships and to develop research capacity. Now, we have done with colleagues who used to be based at HSC, but now moved to Germany. We have done quite a bit of research on the bibliometric analysis of the publications produced by academics in these countries. And we see that between 1993 and 2019, every former Soviet country had a higher proportion of internationally co-authored publications than the world average of 20%. So 3 in 10 publications that are produced by researchers from this region have been internationally co-authored, with significant country-level variations. Obviously, Turkmenistan is a tricky case, so I will not talk about it right now because there are very few publications, so we see very high percentage of international collaboration. But in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, we see very large numbers of publications, very large proportions being internationally co-authored, then followed by Kazakhstan, Latvia, Tajikistan, Armenia, and then others. So we see that this data shows how these countries have opened up, how much work academics have been doing. Most of the academics based in the former Soviet universities, how much they have been doing with international partners to publish, to contribute to the global knowledge creation. While the numbers of the publications perhaps are not very high when compared to other much more powerful Western systems or BRICS, the proportions of international collaborative articles are indeed very high produced from this region. Now, I have recently done also work on the funding for research, where we see that very significant proportions of articles that appear in the global domain, in Scopus, in Web of Science, etc., have received international funding for research. Okay, and from the papers analyzed, when I did a separate study of on international funding sources, we see that academics based in Armenia and Georgia have been particularly successful in this regard, with about 3 in 10 publications in the global domain acknowledging some form of international funding. And the biggest funders, probably you are interested to hear, are the United States and Russia for research in these countries. There have been a lot of changes in relation to the understanding of ethics in research, okay? The international exposures have triggered a wave of new thinking about academic integrity and research ethics. The Soviet higher education and research system did not take academic dishonesty, plagiarism, and research ethics very seriously. Plagiarism was widespread, especially in student papers, and there were no standards to regulate the ethics and integrity of research process or research output. So there are many more conversations about research ethics nowadays, and there are various activities to raise awareness about integrity and ethics in academic communities, many of them organized by universities and some of them organized through various international projects. Now, there are various measures of research performance used across these universities, and one of the biggest measures of research performance are university rankings. There are also journal rankings by impact factor, statistics of journal article citations, and scores for individual academics, and so on and so forth. So some of these countries, such as Russia and Kazakhstan, seem to be using these metrics very extensively in assessing universities, in assessing academics, and so on and so forth. In other countries, the use of metrics is relatively limited. Many of these universities, as I already mentioned, and there are detailed numbers and evidence of this in the book, are in the international rankings, in the QS and Times Higher Education. So Russia has the largest number of universities in these two global rankings, and Russia is followed by Ukraine. Ukraine has 9 universities in Times Higher Education and 6 in QS, and Ukraine is followed by Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. Okay, there are also singular universities from Belarus and Georgia in this ranking. 7 countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, do not have a single research university included in these rankings. However, they have plans. For example, in Uzbekistan, the Soviet University, this formerly Soviet University, Samarkand State, is planned to be supported by the government to become one of the world's 500. So there are these global aspirations, and there are specific policies that aim at measuring performance of universities and academics in a number of these countries. Okay. I have to skip because I know time is running. One little aspect related to this was also the existence of the idea of research university, which is a concept influenced largely by Western discourses of global research universities. So our evidence demonstrated that actually the concept of research universities at the moment exists largely only in Russia and Kazakhstan. So in other parts, in other countries, even in relation to this flagship formerly Soviet institutions, the concept of research university is not that prominent. Research is encouraged, but the idea of research university as such seems to be most prominently featuring only in Russian and Kazakhstani contexts at the moment, okay? So I need to move on, I suppose, and share some concluding thoughts. So universities generally are assumed to be stable over time, as transforming them is considered to be a complex dialectical process of inertia and change. There are lots of jokes about change at Oxford University, how it's seen. So if you Google change and Oxford and jokes, you will see how many jokes have been created on the idea of change, okay? It's you can also search changing a light bulb. Okay, that's quite an interesting whole list of jokes of changing a light bulb, how you can change a light bulb. But that's a little diversion. So change is always tricky. Former Soviet countries represent unique examples, I think, of the extent to which change and transformation is possible in the context of existing authoritative and authoritarian institutional structures that were inherited from the Soviet Union, and in the context of growing international influences from the West, as well as from Russia. Drawing on Arjun Appadurai's idea that globalization is neither just a hopeful process of flows, nor a dark exclusionary process, but a curious dynamic of co-production, the internationalization chapter investigated how cross-border influences, underpinned by a logic of flows that push circulation while simultaneously creating obstacles along the way, have transformed former Soviet universities. International of higher education in former Soviet universities has increased inequalities between institutions. Selected countries which have channeled significant resources in the internationalization of the universities, again, Russia and Kazakhstan are at the top here, appear to be exclusively focused on building research universities. In these increasingly internationalized spaces which encourage free market competition, many former Soviet universities have managed to retain and advance their reputations, becoming more selective and more engaged in global research than they used to be 3 years ago, for sure. So all of these universities, all the 69, are much more engaged internationally than they used to be, because what they used to be was zero international engagement, basically, very limited. Higher education's international status anxiety, a term coined by Anatoly, does not affect universities, governments, and academics in all former Soviet countries to the same extent. Again, the Russian and Kazakhstani governments are highly ambitious status seekers. They invest significant resources to put in place policies directed at the expansion of the research capacity. Governments in other countries seem to either be mildly preoccupied with universities and content to go with the flow, or attempt to encourage private actors and individual universities to bear the burden of developing higher education and research. Thus, market-based competition and international connections are at the heart of the transformation of universities. And as Sarah Amsler notes, Marx and much of what this name entailed and the East are lost, and the market and the West had won. That is not entirely the case, I think, when we consider the links with Russia, but generally and broadly, that is the case in most of the former Soviet countries. The Soviet academia once represented an isolated community of academics with very limited exposure to the world outside the Soviet Union. The secluded nature of the entire academic sector was replicated within the boundaries of universities. These were inward-facing institutions with very limited autonomy and academic freedom. They rarely practiced open recruitment and mostly relied on academic inbreeding, perpetuating these institutional and disciplinary traditions. Soviet academia maintained an unhealthy environment of limited competition or collaboration between institutions and academics. These new socioeconomic and political realities of the post-Soviet period brought about the marketization and internationalization of academia, and encourage universities to open up and engage in relationships of competition and collaboration. Yet, an open society cannot be established by simply opening a closed one, according to Tomusk. While internationalization might have led to significant changes within universities and societies in which they are embedded, the universities themselves, unfortunately, have not fully embraced the freedoms and autonomy afforded by these new realities. I will stop here.